The first time Margaret heard the knock, she thought it was a branch tapping against the glass. But when she turned, she saw a wet, shivering bear cub standing on her back porch, paw raised, looking right at her, and everything in her quiet mountain life changed that morning. Margaret had lived in the same little clapboard house for nearly 50 years. It sat at the edge of the forest, where the pines gave way to a meadow that bloomed with wild flowers in the summer and lay under a quilt of snow in the winter. Life here was quiet, too quiet, some would say. But for Margaret, especially after her husband passed, the stillness was a comfort. She woke early every morning, long before the sun cleared the ridge, to brew her tea and watch the world wake up through her kitchen window. It was a routine so fixed that she could measure her days by the light on the far tree line. The morning it all began, the sky was heavy with rain. It had been falling since before midnight, turning the earth to mud and sending cold rivulets streaming down the gutters. Margaret padded into the kitchen in her slippers, cardigan wrapped tight, and set the kettle on the stove. She was just reaching for her favorite mug, the one with the faded blue flowers, when she heard it. A knock. Not a sharp rap like a person would make, but a dull, rhythmic thump against the glass. She froze, listening. Another knock came, softer this time, followed by the faint scrape of something sliding down the pane. Margaret turned toward the kitchen window, and for a moment, she thought she was seeing things. There, on the back porch, stood a small brown bear cub. Its fur was soaked through, plastered in uneven patches against its small frame. Its dark eyes were wide and fixed on her, and one paw, far too big for its skinny legs, rested against the glass. She gasped before catching herself. The bear didn't flinch. It just stood there, breathing little clouds against the rain-speckled window. Her first thought was to shoo it away. She'd lived in these mountains long enough to know wild animals should never become too comfortable around people. But there was something in the way it stood there, trembling, water dripping from its fur, that kept her from moving. Instead, she stepped closer to the window, her hands instinctively pressing against her cardigan for warmth. "Where's your mama?" she murmured. The cub tilted its head, almost as if it understood the question. She scanned the meadow beyond the porch for any sign of movement, no larger bear in the shadows, no rustle in the trees. Just the steady rain and the gray, quiet morning. Margaret hesitated, then reached for the latch on the window. She lifted it just enough to hear the rain more clearly, and with it, the soft huff of the cub's breath. "You're a brave one," she said softly. "Or maybe just lost." The cub didn't back away. In fact, it pressed its paw a little harder against the glass, the same way a child might lean into a door they wanted to be opened. Margaret wasn't reckless. She didn't swing the window wide or step outside. But she did the one thing she knew might help without crossing that dangerous line. She fetched the small bowl she used for feeding the stray cats that sometimes wandered by. Filling it with water from the tap, she opened the door just a crack and slid it onto the porch. The cub stepped back, eyeing her carefully. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, it padded forward and began to lap at the water. Rain dripped from its muzzle, mixing with the clear drops in the bowl. When it finished, it looked up at her again, blinking slowly. For a moment, she felt an odd pull in her chest, a mix of sorrow and something else, something warmer. "All right," she said, almost to herself. "You just stay there and get warm a bit." She closed the door but didn't leave the window. She stood there, tea forgotten, watching the little bear settle onto the porch boards, its breathing slowing as the minutes passed. By the time the kettle whistled, the cub had curled up in a damp, shivering ball. And Margaret, without realizing it, had already made up her mind that she would watch over it, at least until the rain stopped. The rain finally stopped sometime in the night. Margaret could tell before she even opened her eyes. The air in the bedroom was lighter, the sound outside replaced by the quiet drip of water falling from the eaves. She rose slowly, her joints stiff, and wrapped herself in her cardigan before making her way to the kitchen. It was the same as always: put the kettle on, pull the curtains back, wait for the light to catch the tops of the trees. But that morning there was something different. The porch was empty. Margaret told herself she hadn't expected anything else. Bears wandered through the woods all the time, and the cub had likely gone back to wherever it belonged. She even tried to push it from her mind, focusing instead on slicing a piece of yesterday's bread and warming it over the stove. Then, just as the kettle began to murmur on the burner, she heard it, the knock. It was softer this time, almost tentative. She turned sharply toward the window. There he was. The cub was drier now, though his fur still held a slight wave from yesterday's soaking. His eyes were fixed on her again, paw lifted against the glass as though to say, "I'm back." Margaret let out a sound somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. "Well, you've got some nerve, don't you?" She moved closer to the window, studying him. He didn't look hungry, not the way a starving animal would, but there was no mistaking the way he watched her, calm but expectant. Margaret thought about the warnings she'd heard all her life: never feed wild animals, never let them get used to people. She'd followed those rules for decades. But here she was, standing at her kitchen window with a bear cub looking at her like he already knew she'd cave. She poured a little milk into the metal bowl, diluting it with water. She wasn't sure if it was the right thing to give a bear, but it was all she had for the moment. When she cracked the door to slide it out, the cub stepped back, just far enough to let her place it without feeling threatened. As soon as the bowl hit the porch boards, he moved in. His small pink tongue flicked against the milk's surface, his nose twitching. Margaret stayed in the doorway, watching. She felt oddly less alone. It wasn't like when Ruth came by, or when the mailman stopped for a quick chat. This was different, quieter, simpler. When the bowl was empty, the cub stepped back, gave her one last look, and padded down the steps toward the meadow. His paws made soft prints in the damp wood. Margaret expected that to be the end of it again. But the next morning, just after she lit the stove, she heard the knock. And the morning after that. It became a pattern almost before she realized it. At first, she'd try to prepare something small for him: a little water, a few scraps of bread softened with milk. Each time, the cub approached the window as if he'd been counting the hours since their last meeting. A week passed before she began talking to him. At first, it was only a few words: "Good morning," or "You're early today." But over time, she found herself speaking longer sentences, like she used to when her husband was alive and she'd tell him the day's plans over breakfast. It wasn't until Ruth stopped by for a surprise visit that Margaret realized she might be in over her head. Ruth had pulled up the driveway just as the cub was finishing the last of his water. Margaret, without thinking, had the door open and was halfway into a story about the cub's latest early arrival. Ruth froze, eyes locked on the small bear at the window. "Margaret and Parker, what in heaven's name?" "He's just a cub," Margaret said quickly. "Been coming by in the mornings." Ruth's gaze darted between her and the animal. "You know that's not safe. His mama could be nearby." Margaret shook her head. "If she was, she'd have shown herself by now. He's alone." Ruth pressed her lips into a thin line. "Alone now doesn't mean he'll stay that way. And if he gets used to finding food here, he'll keep coming. Margaret's eyes softened. That's the point. The two women stood in silence for a moment. The cub, oblivious to the conversation, licked the last drop from the bowl and ambled down the porch steps into the trees. When Ruth finally left, she did so with a shake of her head and a muttered, "You're going to be known as the Bear Lady before summer's out." Margaret only smiled to herself. She didn't mind the sound of that. By the third week, Margaret realized something had changed. It wasn't just that the cub was showing up like clockwork, it was how he was filling out. The first time she'd seen him, he had looked small for a bear, his legs a touch too long for his body, his fur patchy from the rain. But now, the angles were softening. His coat was thicker, richer in color. When he stood on the porch, he no longer seemed like a lost scrap of an animal. He was becoming, well, a bear. That morning, the knock came earlier than usual, before she'd even lit the stove. She opened the curtains and found him already there, his breath misting the cool glass. "You're impatient today," she said with a smile. She poured water into the bowl and, on a whim, tore off a piece of apple she'd been saving for her oatmeal. She slid the door open just enough to place the offering. The cub sniffed it, tilted his head, and then, to her quiet satisfaction, took a careful bite. "That's right," she said. "Something sweet for a change." He ate it slowly, as if savoring each bite, then licked the inside of the bowl before sitting back on his haunches, watching her through the glass. Margaret found herself watching him just as intently. She noticed the faint white crescent of fur under his chin, the way his ears flicked at the slightest sound. He didn't seem nervous around her anymore, in fact, he seemed comfortable. Later that week, she tried something she'd been avoiding. She opened the kitchen window while he was on the porch. Just a few inches, but enough that she could hear the low, steady huff of his breathing. "Morning air's nice today," she said, mostly to fill the quiet. The cub didn't back away. Instead, he turned his head slightly, like he was listening. That same day, she noticed another change. He lingered longer after finishing his water. Usually, he'd head back toward the meadow, disappearing into the trees. But now, he'd sit, sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes, as if keeping her company while she moved around the kitchen. One morning, while she was washing dishes, he pressed his paw against the glass with a deliberate thump. She turned, startled, and met his eyes. "You trying to get my attention?" she asked. He held her gaze for a long moment before lowering his paw. Margaret couldn't help but laugh. "Well, you've got it." By early June, word had started to spread beyond just Ruth. A young man from the gas station mentioned to her that his uncle swore he'd seen a bear standing at a kitchen window like it was waiting for breakfast. Margaret had only smiled, neither confirming nor denying the story. Ruth, however, had begun dropping by more often. "Just making sure you're not getting yourself mauled," she'd say, though she always arrived after the cub's usual visiting hour. Margaret appreciated the concern, but she knew the truth. The bear wasn't a threat to her, at least, not now. Still, she was careful. She never touched him, never stepped outside when he was close. She spoke to him in the same low, steady tone every time, letting him decide how near to come. One cool morning, she noticed the cub's shoulders were level with the bottom of the window. It startled her to realize that when she first met him, his head had barely reached that height. Growth came fast in the wild. "You won't be a little one for much longer," she said, leaning against the counter. The cub gave the glass a slow blink, as if to say he already knew. That day, as he turned to leave, Margaret found herself stepping toward the window, watching him cross the yard. His gait was heavier now, the ground giving slightly under his weight. And yet, to her, he was still the wet, shivering cub who'd knocked on her window all those weeks ago. When she sat down that evening with her tea, she realized she had started counting her mornings differently. Not by the sunrise, or by the smell of her tea steeping, but by the sound of that knock. It was no longer just a visit. It was a part of her life. By mid-June, Margaret could have set her clock by him. Every morning, just after the first bird calls drifted through the open kitchen window, she would hear it, the knock. Not random, not frantic. 3 steady thumps, spaced just enough apart to feel deliberate. At first, she told herself it was coincidence. But as the days passed, she realized the rhythm never changed. 3 knocks, always the same, always followed by that silent waiting outside the glass. "You've got your own doorbell, haven't you?" she teased one morning as she opened the curtains. The bear, no longer quite a cub, but not yet the full-grown presence he would one day become, stood there in the early light, fur glowing faintly gold where the sun touched it. His paw hovered over the glass as if ready to repeat the pattern. Margaret filled the bowl with water, adding a slice of pear she'd saved from her breakfast. When she slid it onto the porch, he approached without hesitation. She noticed the way his eyes flicked to hers before he began eating, as if waiting for permission. After he finished, he sat back, and for the first time, Margaret found herself sitting too, at the small kitchen table, her chair angled toward the window. "You're not just here for the food," she said, almost certain of it. "You're here to see me." He gave no sign that he understood, of course, but he didn't leave either. He stayed there while she sipped her tea, both of them watching the yard as the mist slowly burned away. It was during one of those shared silences that Margaret noticed something else. When a jay landed on the porch railing, the bear didn't so much as twitch. But when a branch creaked somewhere deeper in the yard, his head snapped toward it, ears forward, body tensed. He was still wild, still alert to everything around him, but somehow, with her, he seemed at ease. The routine became so ingrained that Margaret began preparing for it without thinking. She'd set out the metal bowl before she even boiled the kettle. Sometimes she'd add fruit, sometimes just water. And every time, without fail, the knock came. 3 beats. Always the same. One particularly foggy morning, she decided to test her theory. She stayed in the sitting room, out of sight of the window, after hearing the first knock. There was a pause. Then, another 3 knocks. Margaret smiled to herself and made her way to the kitchen. When she opened the curtains, the bear was there, head tilted slightly as if to say, "Where were you?" "I hear you," she said, her voice warm. "Don't think I could ignore you if I tried." That was also the morning Ruth called, her voice carrying the faintly disapproving tone Margaret had grown used to. "Don't tell me he's still coming around," Ruth said. "Every morning," Margaret replied. There was a sigh on the other end. "You're turning into his grandma, you know." Margaret chuckled. Better than being nobody's anything. After she hung up, she stood by the window a while longer, watching him finish the water. She thought about what Ruth had said. Grandma. She'd never had children of her own. Never had the chance to fill the house with the kind of family noise she used to imagine. But now, each morning, there was someone who came just for her. That afternoon, while sweeping the porch, she noticed faint muddy prints near the steps, his, she assumed, from the days when the ground was still soft. They trailed off into the yard, then disappeared into the grass. She traced them with her eyes until they vanished. That night, as she set her teacup in the sink, Margaret caught herself glancing toward the darkened porch, wondering where he was sleeping. The thought that he might be curled up somewhere close made her feel oddly settled. The next morning, the knock came right on time. The morning it happened, Margaret woke up before dawn, same as always. She moved through the familiar steps, cardigan, slippers, kettle, but she found herself glancing toward the kitchen window earlier than usual, listening for those 3 steady knocks. They didn't come. At first, she thought she'd simply missed them. Maybe he'd already been and gone, though that had never happened before. She opened the curtains, half expecting to see him standing there, but the porch was empty. Margaret poured water into the metal bowl anyway and set it on the porch. She told herself he might just be late, perhaps chasing some scent through the meadow or stopping at the stream first. But as the minutes passed, the quiet began to press in. The sun climbed, the meadow brightened, and still there was no sign of him. By the time she'd finished her tea, Margaret felt a strange tightness in her chest. It was silly, she told herself. Wild animals didn't keep appointments. He could be anywhere. And yet, she couldn't stop glancing at the porch every few minutes. That afternoon, Ruth stopped by with a basket of eggs from her hens. "You look worried," she said the moment she stepped inside. Margaret hesitated. "He didn't come this morning." Ruth set the basket down with a soft cluck of her tongue. "Margaret, he's a bear. That's not unusual. You can't expect." "He's been here every morning for almost a month," Margaret interrupted. "Never missed a day." Ruth gave her a look, the kind that said she wasn't going to argue, but she didn't agree either. "He'll turn up. Or he won't. That's the way of things." Margaret nodded, but her eyes drifted toward the window again. That night, she left the porch light on, just in case. The next morning, she woke earlier than usual, restless. The kettle hadn't even begun to warm when she heard it, the knock. 3 beats, just the same as always. She hurried to the window, her relief so strong it nearly made her laugh out loud. But as soon as she saw him, the laughter faded. He was muddy, his fur damp, and there was a small burr tangled above his eye. His posture was different too, not quite as steady as usual, like he'd been traveling far. Margaret pressed her palm to the glass. "Where've you been?" He didn't answer, of course, but he lowered his head toward the bowl as she slipped it onto the porch. This time, she added an apple slice without thinking. He ate slowly, pausing to glance toward the yard every so often. Margaret followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual, just the breeze moving through the grass. When he finished, he lingered a little longer than usual, sitting on the porch boards and watching her move around the kitchen. Margaret kept her movements slow, speaking to him now and then in that soft, steady tone. Before he left, he pressed his paw to the glass, not in a knock, but in a quiet pause, holding there for a moment before pulling away. When he ambled back into the meadow, Margaret stood at the window long after he'd gone, the warmth of his return tempered by the new worry taking root in her mind. That night, she found herself wondering if the missing morning had been a fluke, or the first sign that the forest was starting to call him somewhere farther away. The next few mornings were back to normal, 3 steady knocks, the bear waiting patiently, the bowl emptied and left with a faint ring of water inside. Margaret almost convinced herself that the missed morning had been nothing more than a passing adventure. But on the 4th day, as she watched him drink from the bowl, she noticed something unusual. His fur along one shoulder was flattened and slightly darker, like it had been pressed into damp ground for a long time. She stepped closer to the window. You've been lying low somewhere, haven't you? The bear glanced up at her, blinking slowly, then lowered his head again. That afternoon, Ruth stopped by to drop off a loaf of bread. When Margaret mentioned the shoulder, Ruth frowned. Could be he found himself a den. In summer? Margaret asked. Ruth shrugged. Not the usual time, but maybe he's hiding from something. That thought lodged itself in Margaret's mind and refused to leave. She spent the evening sitting on the porch after sunset, listening to the forest. The night air was warm, the scent of pine heavy, but the woods beyond the meadow felt tense. The following morning, the knocks came later than usual, faint, almost hesitant. When she drew back the curtain, he was there, but his eyes flicked toward the trees more often than toward her. Margaret filled the bowl and stepped back, watching as he drank quickly, almost hurriedly, before lifting his head and staring into the woods. "What is it?" she asked softly, as though he might tell her. Then she saw it, a quick flicker of movement at the tree line. Her heart tightened. It wasn't another bear. Too small. A fox, maybe? No, the shape was wrong. Low to the ground, moving with a predator's patience. Margaret's breath caught as the bear turned toward it, muscles tensing. But after a moment, the shape slipped back into the trees. The bear's posture eased, but he didn't resume drinking. Instead, he pressed one paw against the glass, 3 deliberate knocks, then backed away. It was the first time he'd ever knocked after his drink. Margaret stood there long after he left, her pulse still unsteady. Whatever was out there, he clearly didn't like it. That afternoon, she did something she hadn't done in years. She pulled the old binoculars from the top cupboard and cleaned the lenses. She'd bought them decades ago, when she and her husband used to watch hawks circle above the ridge. Just before dusk, she sat by the window, scanning the meadow and the tree line. Once, she thought she saw the same low shape moving between the shadows, but it was gone before she could focus. That night, as she climbed into bed, Margaret felt something she hadn't in years, not fear exactly, but the awareness of another presence in the dark. When morning came, the knocks returned right on time. But this time, before he drank, the bear sat down on the porch, facing the trees. Margaret stood at the window beside him, both of them watching the same patch of forest in silence. The following morning, the knocks came before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. 3 steady beats, just like always, but when Margaret pulled back the curtain, she found him already turned toward the tree line, ears pricked forward. He didn't touch the water she'd left for him the night before. Margaret stood there for a moment, torn. For weeks, she'd kept to her rule, never step outside when he was near. It wasn't just for her safety, it was for his too. But something about the way he sat, unmoving, made her think he wanted her to see whatever it was. She opened the door slowly. He didn't flinch, didn't even turn his head. His focus stayed locked on the woods. The air was cool, with a faint dampness from the night's dew. Margaret stepped onto the porch, her slippers whispering against the boards. "All right," she murmured, "show me." She moved only as far as the porch steps, scanning the meadow. At first, she saw nothing unusual. The grass shifted gently in the morning breeze, birds flickered between branches, the world felt as it always did. Then she spotted it, a patch of flattened grass about halfway to the tree line. It wasn't the irregular kind left by deer lying down. This was longer, stretched out, almost as if something had been crouching there for hours. Margaret's chest tightened. She stepped down into the yard, careful to keep her distance from him. The bear stayed where he was, watching both her and the trees. When she reached the flattened grass, she crouched as best she could. The spot was still warm. She straightened slowly, scanning the woods beyond. The shadows between the trunks were deep, the kind that could hide anything. When she turned back toward the house, she found the bear had moved closer, his massive frame half-shadowed by the porch. He didn't look alarmed, not exactly, but there was a tension in his stance she hadn't seen before. Margaret made her way back up the steps, pausing only to glance once more at the tree line. Whatever had been there wasn't now, but the feeling lingered. Inside, she watched him from the window as he finally lowered his head to the water bowl. But instead of drinking fully, he took a few quick sips, then lifted his head again to stare at the same stretch of forest. It wasn't until he left that she noticed something new, a faint track of paw prints along the edge of the meadow, circling wide around the house. They weren't his, too small, too narrow. That afternoon, Margaret called Ruth. "You ever seen anything hanging around the woods lately?" she asked. Ruth hesitated. "What do you mean?" "Something, watching," Margaret said, her voice low. There was a pause. "Not here." But up past the gas station, one of the men swore he saw a mountain lion cross the road last week. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Mountain lions were rare here, but not unheard of. Still, the prints she'd seen weren't quite right, not cat, not fox. That night, she locked the door earlier than usual and pulled the curtains shut. But sleep didn't come easy. She kept seeing that patch of flattened grass, kept hearing the sound of 3 deliberate knocks. The next morning, when they came, she was already at the window. This time, she didn't open the door. She stayed inside, one hand resting on the counter, watching as he drank from the bowl. When he finished, he lingered, looking between her and the woods, as if waiting for her to understand something unspoken. Margaret's pulse was steady now, but there was a certainty forming in her mind, whatever had been near the meadow hadn't gone far. And for some reason she couldn't explain, the bear didn't want her to step outside again. Margaret woke before sunrise, the kind of waking that wasn't gentle but immediate, as if something had tugged her from sleep. She lay still for a moment, listening. The house was quiet. No wind in the chimney, no creak from the rafters. Just the faint drip of last night's rain from the eaves. She pulled on her cardigan and padded into the kitchen. The porch was still cloaked in that soft blue half-light that comes before the day truly begins. No movement in the meadow. No shadow at the window. It wasn't until she opened the curtains fully that she saw them. Paw prints. They led from the edge of the meadow straight up to her porch steps. Not the broad, rounded marks of the bear, these were narrower, the pads longer, the claws faint but visible in the damp wood where they'd stepped. Margaret's stomach tightened. The rain had stopped hours ago, which meant the tracks were fresh. She slipped on her boots and stepped outside, her breath making small clouds in the cool morning air. Kneeling on the top step, she studied the prints. There was something unsettling about the way they ended abruptly at the porch, right at the spot where the bear usually stood to knock. Her mind turned over possibilities, fox, maybe, though the size was off. Coyotes came through sometimes, but never this close to the house. She followed the tracks back into the yard, crouching to see where they disappeared into the grass. The trail curved toward the tree line, weaving through the low growth in a way that felt deliberate, almost like the animal had been circling. A soft sound made her straighten, the creak of the porch boards behind her. She turned quickly, half expecting to see the bear, but the steps were empty. Then she realized the sound hadn't come from behind her at all, it had come from the far side of the house. Margaret moved slowly, keeping to the edge of the yard, until she could see the other side of the porch. That's when she spotted him. The bear was there, standing still, his head low and his gaze fixed on the ground near the steps. She followed his line of sight and saw it, more prints, pressed deep into the damp earth, circling back toward the woods. The bear lifted his head to look at her, then back toward the trees. He didn't move until she stepped closer to the porch, at which point he turned and walked toward the window. When he reached it, he knocked 3 deliberate beats. Margaret's pulse was steady but quick. She wasn't sure if the knock was his usual greeting or a warning. She fetched the water bowl and placed it on the porch. He drank, but his eyes kept flicking toward the meadow. When he left, he didn't take his usual slow route toward the stream. Instead, he cut across the yard in the direction the other prince had gone, disappearing into the shadows beneath the pines. Margaret stayed at the window long after he was gone, staring at the place where the tracks vanished. She'd lived on this land most of her life. She knew the patterns of the deer, the foxes, even the occasional black bear passing through. But this felt different. That evening, she took the old lantern from the hall closet and placed it by the back door. She had the strange feeling she might need it before the week was out. The paw prints returned the very next morning. Margaret found them before the bear arrived, damp, sharp-edged impressions that trailed from the woods, across the meadow, and right up to the porch. This time, they weren't alone. A second set of prints, broader, heavier, overlapped them in places. By the time she spotted him emerging from the tree line, the sun had just started to thin the mist. The bear's fur glistened faintly with dew, his ears forward, his pace deliberate. But as he neared the porch, Margaret noticed his eyes never left the edge of the meadow. He didn't knock. Not right away. Instead, he stopped halfway across the yard, turned broadside toward the trees, and stood completely still. Margaret felt the air shift. There was no wind, but the meadow seemed to hold its breath. Then she saw it. A shape moved just inside the shadows, low to the ground, smooth in its motion, every step placed with precision. At first, she thought it might be a coyote, but it was larger, its body more fluid, its shoulders rolling with each step. A mountain lion. Margaret had only seen one once before in her life, and never this close. The cat's coat blended with the earth, its tail flicking in slow arcs behind it. It wasn't looking at her. It was looking at him. The bear stayed rooted, his head low but his frame steady, as if drawing a line neither of them could cross. Margaret stepped back from the window without thinking. Her heart pounded in her ears. She knew better than to make noise, but the urge to call out, to warn him, was almost unbearable. The mountain lion took another step, closing the distance by a few feet, then stopped. Its tail stilled. The standoff stretched, silent except for the faint drip of water from the eaves. Finally, the cat's head twitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, and it stepped backward into the shadows. 1 step. 2. Then it was gone. The bear didn't move for several more seconds. When he finally did, it was only to turn toward the porch. He walked up, set one paw gently against the glass, and knocked. 3 steady beats. Margaret's throat felt tight. She managed a small nod, as if he could see the gratitude in the gesture. When she placed the water bowl on the porch, he drank, pausing only once to glance back toward the meadow. There was no trace of the cat now, but Margaret knew it had seen her too. When he finished, the bear didn't leave right away. Instead, he circled the house once, slow and deliberate, before disappearing toward the stream. Margaret stayed at the window long after, her tea cooling untouched in her hands. She'd never thought of the knocks as anything more than habit, but now she wondered if they'd been something else all along. Not just a greeting, but a way of saying I'm here. You're safe. For the next week, the visits were different. The bear still knocked, still drank from the bowl, but now he arrived earlier, always scanning the meadow before stepping onto the porch. Some mornings, he came from the west, other times from the east, as if circling the property before appearing at the window. Margaret found herself adjusting her own routine to match his. She rose before first light, lit the kitchen lamp, and waited. The old house, once quiet at dawn, now felt alive with a strange energy, not fear exactly, but a sense that each day began with something unspoken passing between them. It was the third morning after the standoff with the mountain lion when she noticed it again. Fresh prints in the meadow, narrow and deliberate, leading halfway toward the porch before veering off sharply into the trees. The bear had arrived minutes later, wet with dew, his fur darker along his sides from brushing against undergrowth. When she set out the water, he drank quickly, then lifted his head to look at her, a steady, unblinking gaze that seemed to hold weight. "You're still watching for him, aren't you?" she asked softly through the glass. He lowered his head again, but not to drink. Instead, he pressed his paw flat against the window pane, holding it there for several seconds before turning toward the woods. That day, he didn't return the way he came. Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon glancing out the window more than usual. The mountain lion hadn't shown itself again, but she could feel its presence somewhere beyond the meadow. It was a knowing that came from years of living close to the land. You didn't need to see everything to know what moved in the shadows. On Sunday, Ruth stopped by. She noticed the binoculars on the counter and shook her head with a small smile. "You've got yourself a sentry," she said, nodding toward the window. Margaret didn't argue. The knock came while Ruth was still there. The bear appeared at the porch steps, pausing to glance at the meadow before approaching. Ruth froze, taking in the size of him, the quiet steadiness of his movements. "He really does come every day," she whispered. Margaret smiled faintly. "Told you." When the bear finished his drink, he didn't leave right away. Instead, he turned his head toward the woods and let out a low, rumbling huff, not loud, but deep enough to carry across the meadow. It was the first sound he'd made to her since the morning he'd arrived muddy and late. That night, Margaret sat on the porch long after dark, the lantern casting a soft circle of light around her feet. She didn't see him, but once, just once, she thought she caught the faintest echo of his huff somewhere in the trees. By the following week, the paw prints stopped appearing. Whether the mountain lion had moved on or simply decided this was no longer worth the trouble, she didn't know. But she noticed the bear's posture changing again, less tense, more like it had been before. Still, the ritual never went back to exactly what it had been. He still circled the meadow before arriving, still glanced at the tree line between sips of water. And every so often, before leaving, he'd press his paw to the glass, not a knock, not a warning, but something quieter. One crisp autumn morning, with the first frost silvering the grass, Margaret stood at the window as he finished his drink. When he turned to leave, she tapped the glass 3 times. He stopped. Looked back at her. For a moment, it felt like they had traded places. Then he dipped his head and walked into the trees, the frost crunching softly beneath his paws. And Margaret knew, no matter how many mornings passed, no matter how many winters and summers came, she'd always listen for that knock. Not just as a greeting, but as a reminder, someone out there was watching out for her, too.